Hello and welcome to the Life Science Report, a podcast from Back Bay Life Science Advisors. My name is Pete Bak, a managing director here at Back Bay, and today I'm joined by my friends and colleagues Thienel and Brendan Wang, engagement managers here at Back Bay. As we kick off 2023, they're here to discuss some of the trends, issues, and articles that most intrigue them from 2022. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, Pete. Glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. Pleasure to be here.
So, Brendan, Christian, can you talk a bit about what you reviewed and what topics most piqued your interest from 2022?
Yeah, and I would say the initial list of topics that we, as we were kind of scraping through the headlines from January 22 through December, that initial list was pretty long. So there were definitely a lot of runner-ups, and we'll kind of call out those, but as we go. But we kind of broke it up into a couple of news categories that are of interest to us. So things like key data and trial readouts, big company and corporate changes, so like M&A and partnerships, that sort of thing, market access and reimbursement, regulatory changes, and there were some very interesting ones this year, and then just cool science. And so ultimately we landed on three big ones that we'll talk about today. The first being sort of updates in CRISPR and gene editing. And then Christian will kind of talk through some progress in gene therapy reimbursement. And there was a lot of movement in that space this year. Right. And then that sort of last topic being a cool science headline that ties in, I promise, to some of the other topics. And that's on xenotransplantation. And our intern Micheka helped with a lot of the research there. So some of the runner-ups, and I'd be remiss if we skipped over that, include, increased focus and interest in the anti-infective space beyond, COVID-19, which has dominated a lot of the headlines. And then from a regulatory perspective, there were a couple really interesting ones. So obviously the Inflation Reduction Act, and there's been a lot of separate coverage of that recently. Accelerated approval reform, which is also getting talked about a lot. I think the FDA commissioner addressed it recently at the JPM conference. And then early 2022, we saw the FDA's perspective kind of change a bit on the use of single country ex-US pivotal data for approval, and with Eli Lilly's PD-1 and the headlines there. Aducanumab obviously covered ad nauseum throughout 22, and there were a lot of parallels, I thought, with Amylyx's ALS therapy, and that obviously played out a slightly different way than aducanumab. And then now we see this evolving story with lecanemab, and hopefully in the first half of the year, donanemab. So a lot of stuff that I think, we considered really interesting headlines. The ones we'll talk about today, as I outlined earlier, those were the ones that made the final list.
Yeah.
So
certainly we could spend an entire podcast on a lot of those topics, and it'd be interesting to see what happens with lecanemab, given what happened with the other product. So anyway, saving those for another day. How about we get right into it with the topic being the progress in gene therapy and gene editing. Obviously, we've covered this in previous podcasts, and here at Back Bay have done a lot of work over the past half decade as the field evolves. What's really exciting is we're starting to see more and more data being generated. Similar products, both having data drops in the same space, within sickle cell disease, gene editing assets moving forward with their BLA closer to commercial launch. So, it'd be great to hear sort of what you guys saw and what intrigued you most from the past year there.
Yeah. So, and we've done, as you mentioned, we've done a lot of work in the editing space, particularly in the last 2-3 years, which obviously matches the increasing investor
Mhm.
and scientific interest in the field. I think the way I at least think about the field is, ex vivo applications and then in vivo
Yep.
applications of editing. And ex vivo is sort of the furthest along, just given it's technically a little bit easier. You kind of take out that variable of like, what is the Cas9 or the editing construct? What does that do long term in vivo by
Mhm.
doing it ex vivo? So on the ex vivo front, we saw a number of key data readouts. So Bluebird's FDA got FDA approval, obviously for
Mhm.
Zynteglo in transfusion dependent thalassemia. So that was a big one. That one's a little different than some of the other assets we'll talk about because that one uses a lentiviral um, vector, and it was approved in Europe before it was in the US. But it was very exciting to see that approval come through. So
Yeah.
that was obviously a big one. On another topic, CRISPR Therapeutics and Vertex, they're partnered on a couple of assets. And so for CTX001 or Exicel, they got some durability data back in transfusion dependent thalassemia in 44 patients, of which 42 were transfusion free.
Yeah.
And the earliest patient that they enrolled in the trial was transfusion free for over 3 years. There were two patients who could not get off of transfusions, but they saw pretty substantial reductions in the number and
Yeah.
frequency that they had to receive. So that's pretty outstanding. And obviously, that's among the first data that we're getting back for the gene editing field as a whole, which
Sure.
is really exciting. On that same asset, Exicel is also being studied in sickle cell disease, as you alluded to, Pete.
Yeah.
And so they got data back in the sickle cell area as well. So they had 31 patients in that trial with no severe veno-occlusive VOCs. And they're the earliest patient enrolled in the trial had not had a severe VOC in 32 months.
Yeah.
So again, I think, there were questions 1 or 2 years ago on what is the durability of effect
Sure,
going to be.
yeah.
That obviously has huge implications to reimbursement,
Exactly,
among
yeah.
other things, which Christian will touch on. And as of now, it looks like the initial data looks pretty promising on that front.
Yeah.
So the current estimate, I think publicly, is that in the first quarter of this year, 2023, we'll see filings for Exicel in, I think, one or both of those indications.
Yeah.
So following up behind them, we have Editas as well. So within 2022, they released very recently in December initial data on 2 patients. They don't have long-term data yet. So the 2 patients so far are at 5 months and 1.5 months, but the initial data looks like they've checked the boxes of
Yeah.
it's safe, and the responses so far appear to be pretty robust.
Yeah. And Brendan, as we sort of move from the ex vivo approaches to the in vivo approaches, just for the uninitiated and folks that may not be in the weeds here, when we talk about ex vivo, basically what we're doing, or not we, what the physicians are doing are taking out a patient's hematopoietic stem cell, editing it, and then after some conditioning where they ablate the patient's bone marrow, basically reconstitute them with the edited product, which, while fascinating, certainly is a different level of complexity than just adding the editing vector into the body and letting it find the tissue and edit within a patient while they're walking around, essentially. So, just to sort of level set those specific indications and assets we're talking to before we move over to the other side of the house, as it were.
Yeah, and it's very similar to autologous CAR T
Certainly,
therapies that have now been around for a couple of years, and yeah, as you mentioned. But the key challenges are the sort of like supply chain, because everything is customized to the individual patient,
Yeah.
and that vein to vein time. So once you take that sample,
Yeah.
how much processing time is there before you can get
Yeah.
reinfused with your specific cells?
Yeah.
So
on the in vivo front, bring us up to date there.
yeah. So in vivo, I think it's a bit earlier than ex vivo. Again, ex vivo was the lower hanging fruit from a technical and execution perspective. In vivo, though, we did get some initial data back. I thought that was extremely impressive and interesting. So in early 2022, we saw Editas, their asset Edit 101, showed some mixed results in LCA10, which is an inherited form of blindness. Ultimately, that was scrapped, I think, a couple of months ago. So that, maybe not as favorable as we had hoped, but as we know with science, you win some and you lose a lot. So that's one that maybe didn't go so favorably. Because Edit 101, that was in the main organ is the eye. It is also a little bit of a unique case because the eye is sort of an immune privileged organ. So when we think about in vivo therapies in general, I think more of systemic administration.
Sure, yeah.
And so on that front, Intellia generated some really interesting data in transthyretin amyloidosis, or ATTR amyloidosis, as well as hereditary angioedema, or HAE for short. So both of those therapeutic areas are interesting. I think those in the industry, those who've been in the industry for a while, will know that they have both of those diseases have a number of approved biologics, or in the case of ATTR, some RNA-based therapeutics in the last couple of years. So this is the first time we're seeing in vivo editing data, and it'll be really interesting to see how it plays out once you have the sort of the ability for these one and done or very long-term treatments versus having some of those chronically therapies that are available, how that'll play out over the next couple of years. So in ATTR, what we saw was a toxic protein reduction of about 52%, up to, in some patients, 87%, which is pretty impressive. And in 6 patients, there was an average reduction of 93%. So 3 patients reached 9 months follow-up following the initial infusion, and continued to have an average of 80% reduction in that toxic protein, again, for that ATTR amyloidosis. So again, it's not multi-year data, but we are approaching 1 year, and the data so far look very robust. We also, on the HAE, or hereditary angioedema front, again, saw some strong durability data there. So based on some initial data in 3 patients, 2 of them were attack-free through 16 weeks, and 1 was attack-free after week 10 through week 16. And we'll see how the durability of that over multiple years goes. But one of the key biomarkers that they look for in HAE, that reduction was between 65 and 90%, which is pretty comparable with the current standard of care, Takhzyro, which is a biweekly treatment from Takeda, which launched in the last couple of years. So very, very, very impressive.
I think, just to add to, I think it'll be interesting to see how some of the durability data with in vivo gene editing plays out relative to some of the discussion around some of the AAV-based gene therapies in the past couple of years, where kind of the durability of effect has been a key question of, is this going to maintain for 5, 10 plus years? Are we going to need some kind of like a booster or some kind of like reinfusion that really, they're not necessarily one time, but that, that's still to be seen and borne out in data. But I think it'll be interesting to see if the gene editing, products or assets have that same, that same concern or that same issue potentially from the external perspective.
Gotcha.
So I would say the last sort of key, it was not really a data readout, but interesting headline was that we saw the entry of a base editor as well in 2022 into the clinic. So Verve dosed its first patient in July with Verve 101, a base editor designed to deactivate PCSK9 in patients with heterozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. Try to say that 10 times fast.
Good job this time.
And so data from that trial is expected in 2023, and we at that time point would anticipate some data on safety, PCSK9 levels, and LDL-C reduction, which are the key measures that we look for in that particular indication. So I think some of the key sort of themes, implications, et cetera, that we're constantly thinking about and that we'll continue monitoring throughout 2023 is how are companies ultimately going to differentiate, particularly as you just heard, there's a lot of players with gene editing modality in transfusion-dependent thalassemia, sickle cell disease. And so as those spaces get more and more crowded, is there going to be a winner? Are those spaces big enough to accommodate multiple products?
Yeah.
And what are the key attributes that patients and physicians will really hone in on that drives their decision-making as to which product they ultimately receive?
Excellent. And so Christian, we talked a little bit about the evolution of the space. We're starting to see some regulatory approvals for next-gen assets rack up, right? A couple in the U.S. We talked about Zynteglo, a few others in the U.S. and EU for hemophilia, and now, right as the field evolves, we're starting to get more data on how, be it regional HTAs in the EU and payers in the United States, are beginning to view these areas and assets. So maybe you can bring us up to speed there.
Yeah, definitely. So I think 2022 is a really interesting year, with respect to, as you mentioned, Pete, kind of gene therapies and the, some of the later stage programs there. I think it was also a bit of a resurgence in, kind of positive news for gene therapies and in sort of later stage products. As there were 4 FDA approved, or 4 major regulatory approvals, 3 in FDA and an additional one in Europe in 2022, with 2 from Bluebird being Zynteglo and Skysona, both approved, as well as Hemgenix from CSL Behring, and then Roctavian approved in Europe. And again, I think that's a bit of a some positive momentum for gene therapies as it relates to regulatory approvals moving into commercial use and that sort of thing. I think one of the big questions that I think we continue to get a lot, in the work that we do, is around reimbursement for these therapies.
Certainly.
How are payers going to think about them, particularly in Europe, where it's been a bit tougher sledding, as it relates to some of these pricing and reimbursement decisions. And I think, the most notable example being, Bluebird's kind of issues with Zynteglo. They kind of initially launched in Europe. It was a very high-profile situation. Everyone was very excited about it, at least from the industry perspective. And, they ultimately weren't able to reach an agreement with the GBA in Germany. It initially launched in the sort of, initial launch period and wound up, withdrawing from Germany. They also weren't able to reach an agreement with NICE in the UK. And ultimately withdrew from Europe, entirely, and their kind of commercial presence. So I think that was a bit of a surprise and cast quite a bit of doubt on, is Europe long term going to be a viable market for this sort of gene therapy business model? I think they were looking for kind of a $1.8 million price paid out over 5 installments, and obviously we'll never know what goes on in those discussions, and that's all confidential. But I think some insight potentially comes from the ICER review, which was, I think, a big news in 2022 for Zynteglo. And for anyone who's not familiar, ICER is the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review.
Yeah.
They're a nonprofit based in Boston. They do a lot of kind of health economic based analysis, and they've become pretty famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, for kind of their assessments of particularly higher priced oncology and cell and gene therapy products in assessing what is a cost effective price. And an interesting thing is if you look at them in the oncology space, they're often sometimes orders of magnitude below where products are priced in the U.S. But often with gene therapies and cell therapies, they're a little bit closer to kind of where companies ultimately come out. And I think an interesting piece was their analysis of Zynteglo basically showed that around $2 million was potentially a cost effective price for the product. Bluebird launched at $2.8 million in the U.S., so a little bit higher than that. But I think one of the key learnings from that report, which potentially has some line of sight into the decision making in Europe, was that there was a lot of variability in that model around the durability effect, obviously, for Zynteglo, but also kind of some of the complexities of the standard of care, and the cost offsets that might be there, where there was basically a range from below $1 million to up to $2 million that could be a cost-effective price. And I think one of the issues we often see with HTAs is that any uncertainty in a pricing analysis, or particularly a cost-effectiveness kind of analysis, is really one of the key reasons why they're hesitant to reimburse or reach an agreement. So
it'll be interesting to see that that question of durability of response sort of influencing how sponsors think about trial design and timing in a space where, inherently due to the regulatory structures, you have a very fast to market approach where many a times you're approved based on a very well validated, certainly biomarker, but a biomarker nonetheless. And if, the difference between 700,000 and 2 million is based on a couple of years of data, how do you think through tactically that launch price? It'll be interesting.
Right. I totally agree. And I think there's obviously been a lot of talk around these sort of innovative payment models or other types of contracting that you could look at. But I think as we've seen in the sort of Germany example for Bluebird, it's potentially, I would presume that was part of the discussion and wasn't enough to get it over the finish line. So
and I guess the other wrinkle is, and for folks that want to go back and listen to the podcast with Alexander Knotts with UCOPE, and he brought it up as how sort of centralized review may change that, right?
Yeah,
and you've
definitely
got sort of not 20-something bodies in their perspective, but one. And as you begin to see some of the first, when that happens in, I think it was 2025.
For
what their
cell and gene therapy,
and will be. So
yeah, I think it's really interesting. I was also reading about that a little bit in kind of preparation for this, and one of the interesting notes was actually that the initial plan for that kind of centralized HTA was intending to rely a lot on the kind of NICE analysis and sort of their contribution, but now that they're not part of the EU anymore, it's kind of complicates a bit of the who has a seat at the table in terms of putting together that framework. So really interesting stuff.
So can you guys, and I must have missed this headline in 2022. Can you is this centralized HTA review process, like is it like a non-binding type of okay.
At least that is how the as I understand it, the legislation is currently written, is that it would be a non-binding assessment where each individual state is still responsible for their own pricing and reimbursement decision making. But I think it'll be interesting to see to what extent how this plays out and how that becomes could it be like a de facto this is the decision versus do we keep the same kind of structure in place in each market. I think the intention is to sort of eliminate some of these exact types of issues where you'll have one market that an agreement can't be reached and you can in another, and it leads to these decisions that are strategic in nature for a company just not doing business in Europe. And obviously I think they view that as a negative. So
So what else? Maybe talk about some of the U.S. launches and pricing expectations and what's going on there.
Yeah, sure. So I think that, I mean, the most interesting kind of recent one being, CSL Behring's
Yep.
Hemgenics, which was approved, about a month ago for hemophilia B, which, as we know, has been an area that we've looked at a lot,
Sure.
on kind of all sides of our business in terms of a lot of interest from the industry and investors there. And, I think, obviously that product was notable in that it is the most expensive therapy of all time at about, $3.5 million per course of therapy. But again, there was an ICER review for that felt that, a price of around $3 million actually was, potentially cost effective and made it, economic sense.
Yeah.
Although the kind of key caveat there is that factor replacement therapy, in ICER's opinion, is drastically overpriced.
Sure.
So there's some complication, I guess, of the
Interesting. Yeah.
kind of inputs there.
I never thought of that as if you're referencing a high-priced drug that ICER doesn't like, or ICER deems too expensive anyway, how that plays into it. That's an interesting wrinkle I never thought of.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of like a garbage in, garbage out sort of situation from a modeling perspective.
Yeah.
Not to cast aspersions on any
Metaphorically.
Of the pricing. Exactly. But yeah, I think broadly in the U.S., it's been more of a case of what type of contracting are you willing to engage with. It's not really been a question of reimbursement or not. It's not been as binary, I think, as we've seen in Europe, and it's a bit more around to what extent are companies willing to engage with payers around innovative contracting models. What's going to work for plans of somebody like a United versus somebody that's a regional like a Harvard Pilgrim or a regional health plan that's only covering a couple million lives. And I think part of the concern on the U.S. payer side is more around some of their kind of smaller employer-based health insurance groups where, if Google or Apple have a gene therapy need in their plan, that's really not going to kind of break their budget. But if a 40-person auto dealership has that's
Sure.
potentially a huge issue, right? And I think this is something that we've heard a lot on the payer side. So I think there's definitely I think a bit of a different dynamic there, and it's really just more around how do you tactically approach that? How are you willing? What are you willing to concede on in terms of that contracting structure? And I think it's been interesting, the willingness from the payer side to engage in these types of agreements where historically they want to keep things as simple as possible in terms of, maybe we get a discount, maybe we don't, but there's no outcomes or anything to track. Versus on the gene therapy side, I think they've been much more willing to engage in, tracking outcomes, clinical, data, post-marketing studies, those kinds of things, which I think is a really interesting and, probably productive outcome.
Yeah. Okay.
And Christian, I don't know, have you heard, whether in the past 6 months or a year or whatever, like the two common roadblocks to implementing some of those more complex outcomes-based agreements tends to be like that dynamic that we see in the US where patients are on a plan for like 3-4 years, but then because they change jobs or they move or, whatever, they'll be on a completely different plan. So there's questions of, how do you track those patients? And then the other being the feasibility of actually tracking patient outcomes. And, is the system set up to do that effectively for, what in totality amounts to a decent chunk of patients, hypothetically, right?
Yeah, so I think to the second part of your question is probably the easier one to answer. I think in terms of it's just given the kind of overall number of patients, it's a little bit easier to track outcomes and things as opposed to doing a value-based contract for every type 2 diabetes patient in the U.S. is just not feasible to be tracking that much data. But I think if a plan has 1 or 2 SMA patients in their plan, it's really not that much of a lift to track those outcomes and data, especially as they're able to put. I think a lot of plans have also put in some level of kind of automated reporting. Not I guess fully automated in terms of it's all digital, but I think there's infrastructure at least in place to facilitate these types of agreements on a small scale. For the cell and gene therapy type approaches. I think to your first question, kind of around how they're managing sort of, turnover of patients or members of the plan. Yeah, I think that's still a concern that a lot of these plans have. And it's sort of, to be seen now. We're at, about 3 years since Zolgensma launched. So I think that could potentially get some more insight on that in the next year or two. But I think another one major piece is that all these plans are also reinsured for all these patients as well. So if there is somebody who leaves their plan that they've paid money for already, they do also have kind of insurance in place for that to protect their downside risk as well. So I think that's also become a big part of it in these plans, making sure that they have reinsurance in place for any sort of large cost outlay. And I think there is also a kind of a sense of, collectively, this potentially comes out in the wash in terms of the, grand scheme of, we might get one patient come into our plan who moves, or somebody else moves out of ours. Obviously, there are cases where an individual plan might have 5 or 10 SMA patients that, it's a smaller plan. But again, that's kind of those, I think the reinsurance cases is sort of how that's being managed. Generally, we'll see how sustainable that is.
Yeah. So switching gears entirely from commercial and insurer dynamics to things that are just beginning to enter human studies. At the outset, Brendan, you sort of teased the discussion around xenotransplantation. So walk us through that.
Yes, absolutely. So I think the idea that you can take an organ from a non-human animal species and transplant it into a human is like from science fiction, right? And so I think for a little bit of historical context, cross-species xenotransplantation would be, a procedure or transplantation or infusion of live cells, tissues, or organ from a non-human source into a human. And that can be done either in vivo or ex vivo. But to date, we've seen mostly ex vivo xenotransplantation, such as like for skin grafts and that sort of thing. That procedure, dates all the way back to 1838 for blood transfusion in patients with, certain pathological conditions and diseases. And there are sources that say that goes even further back to the 1600s as well. So there's a history of it, but anyway, include some of that background just to show you how far we've come over.
May not be science fiction after all.
Yeah, exactly. So the first attempt in animal to human heart transplantation occurred in 1964 by James Hardy. He implanted a chimpanzee heart into a semi-comatose amputee that ultimately failed for a number of reasons and complications, but it was the start to, our understanding of the potential for doing this sort of thing. So all that historical context out of the way, that brings us to 2022. So in very early 2022, we saw that the cardiac team at the University of Maryland School of Medicine performed the first xenotransplant using a pig heart into a 57-year-old male patient who had terminal stage heart failure and was unqualified for a cardiac allotransplant. So they did the procedure. After the procedure, the patient functioned well with the transplanted heart and showed no signs of rejection for about 2 months before the patient passed away eventually as a result of heart failure. So for us, I think there were a few really interesting aspects to this story, and 2 questions came up. Why pigs? And then why now? Like, why was now the time to attempt this sort of thing? So on that first question, so why pigs? So physicians, it turns out, they turn to pigs as potential donors for recipients because the pig heart has similar size, anatomy, and function to the human heart. The challenge historically for using them in xenotransplants has to do with porcine endogenous retroviruses, or PERVs, and those are present in all pig genomes, and they're directly integrated as DNA copies. So they're really hard to get rid of. With the advent, and so then the second question is why now? So with the advent in the last 5 plus years of CRISPR and Cas9 gene editing, so essentially you can use gene editing to inactivate all proviral copies in the pig genome and eliminate the risk of PERV transmission when using pig tissues for xenotransplants. So they essentially did a bunch of ex vivo editing of the pig organ before they transplanted it into the patient to get rid of some of that risk of sort of infectious, pathogens and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Huh.
And I think, in terms of broader applicability, this is interesting because, obviously we've done a good amount of work in the solid organ transplant space. So there's obviously a huge need. And I think one really I'd say organ transplantation as a sort of disease area is pretty niche. So for those who aren't operating in that space, one really interesting statistic is that there are about 89,000 kidney transplant candidates on the wait list in the US. And the annual procedure volume for kidney transplants is only around 24,000 as of the most recent year.
Right.
So you can see there's a pretty large delta there. So that means that for kidney transplants specifically, there's an average wait of 3 to 5 years. Now for other solid organs, the delta is not so substantial.
Yeah.
But even for heart transplant procedures, there are around 3,300 candidates on the wait list, and the annual procedure volumes are maybe a little higher than that.
Gotcha.
So you still end up waiting, not uncommonly 6 months to a year for a heart transplant. So, and these patients are very critically ill, as you can imagine. These are major organs that, have very low levels of functioning. So the unmet need is very significant.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, it all comes back to CRISPR, I guess, on today's episode. So thanks, Brendan. That was a really interesting story, and we'll definitely monitor what's happening on gene editing as it touches transplantation. Well, guys, I appreciate you doing this work and sharing your thoughts on what transpired in these spaces in 2022, and let's definitely plan on doing it again next year. And thank you all for joining us here on the Life Science Report from Back Bay Life Science Advisors. You can find all our podcasts and white papers and thought pieces on our website at bblsa.com, bblsa.com. Thanks again, and see you next time on the Life Science Report.